Hey guys, today I wanted to talk to you about bottlenecks on your PC. Alright, there are about 6 or 7 different types of bottlenecks that you can have on your PC, and only 3 of them ever get noticed. Number 1 being your CPU, number 2 being your RAM, number 3 your graphics card, and here's a few ones that you might have missed out on. So you have a hard drive that can be a bottleneck, temperatures can be a bottleneck, and your motherboard can also be bottlenecking your computer. So number 1 I want to talk about first is temperatures. Okay, if your temperatures are high and stuff, you're going to have a problem running your CPU. Your CPU is going to overheat, and it's going to cause your CPU to down throttle. You don't want your CPU down throttling, because once it does that, your computer's going to start lagging and doing all weird stuff. As well, if you don't have enough cooling or something, your hard drives, your SSDs, can also overheat. Yet most SSDs should be fine without any sort of cooling blowing over them. Your M.2 drives should be okay as well, because they're usually sitting there fine. They don't really need too much airflow going through them, so that's not really the problem. But if you have a graphics card that's full of dust, it's going to cause lots of lagging and stuttering in your games, because it's going to get too hot. If your graphics card is over 73 degrees, it's probably overheating. Now, anything under 70 degrees is good. Some graphics cards brands and stuff, the older ones, can get a little bit hotter than 73 degrees, and that's fine. For your CPU as well, make sure your cooler is clean. It has no dust in it. Otherwise, yeah, you're going to have problems cooling it. The next thing I wanted to talk about is your hard drives. So this is where you get hard drive bottlenecks. So in your hard drive, like if you're using an old hard drive with its disk, not an SSD, not a M.2, trying to load things off your hard drive, if your CPU is too fast for your hard drive, what will happen is your hard drive will become the bottleneck. So if you're playing a game and you're running down the street, or let's say GTA 5, for example, is a good one. If you're going too fast in that game and you see like the map appearing in front of you, like you're driving along the road and all of a sudden the road disappears and none of the buildings are loaded, and like it's just blank space all of a sudden, that's because what's on your hard drive, it's not coming off your hard drive fast enough for the game to work. To fix that, obviously you can get an SSD or you can get an M.2. Usually an SSD is pretty adequate for running most things now. I found problems in like Shadow of the Tomb Raider on a hard drive. It will do some funky stuff if you are running a hard drive. So going onto an M.2, it gets rid of like most of the funky things that happens, and it also increases, like, makes your loading times way faster on a M.2 or an SSD. So I'd recommend you change your hard drives to an SSD or an M.2 for playing certain games. Older games, it's not too bad, but like games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, things like even big games, the bigger the game, the more you'd want it on an SSD or an M.2. Other thing I wanted to talk about as well is your motherboard. So if you have a really cheap motherboard and a really high-end CPU, so you have a top-of-the-range CPU and you're trying to run it on like a $50 motherboard, it's probably going to be bottlenecking your CPU. And by the way, I mean bottlenecking is not slowing it down, but it could be causing your computer to be unstable and cause crashes and other things like that. So what happens is the VRMs on a cheap board usually don't have any adequate cooling, which you could just put a fan on them, and it might fix all your problems. So the bottlenecks that happen with your motherboard, if your game just suddenly freezes up for like a second or two and then continues playing and then freezes up again for another second or two and then keeps playing, like you get major stutters, it can be because your motherboard is not adequate enough to run your CPU, which I found the hard way from an X370 board, and I don't really have an example to show you, but you just trust me on that one, because it's crazy when you have a really bad VRM and your board is not delivering the power to the CPU that the CPU is needed. And what happens is the whole system just hangs. It just freezes for a second. And when you're trying to play a game like COD, first-person shooter, a competitive game, and you're getting freezes, like it can even be in the form of micro stutters, or like maybe your game might just randomly crash all of a sudden. That can be because your VRMs are getting too hot. And I'll just recommend like making sure, if you don't have a computer yet and you're looking at getting one, make sure you have a motherboard that is, suited for the CPU that you're getting. So if you're going to get a low-end CPU, that's fine. You can put you can get a low-end motherboard for a low-end CPU. If your CPU is pulling like 150 watts or 200 watts or 250 watts, I think some Intel ones pull, you're going to want like a higher end board for that. If your CPU is only pulling about 60 watts, you should be fine with like a medium or low end board. Although I'd still recommend a higher end board for looking after your components, especially your CPU, as your CPU is like the brain of the computer. And if the brain freezes, everything freezes. With your graphics card as well. So your graphics card can be the bottleneck as well. So if your CPU is too powerful for your graphics card, your CPU will then be waiting for the graphics card to make its frames for when you're playing games. And, it's not a bad thing that the CPU is more powerful than your graphics card. That's more what you want. When it's the other way around, however, so this becomes a CPU bottleneck when it's the other way around, and your graphics card is too powerful for your CPU, you'll get stutters and micro hitches and things like that. So you want to make sure that your graphics card isn't more powerful than your CPU, because you could run into little problems, hiccups and things like that. So and the best way to find out if your CPU is bottlenecking your GPU or if your GPU is bottlenecking your CPU is, so if it's a GPU bottleneck, usually changing resolutions will show you that your GPU is bottlenecking. So if you run a 1080p monitor and you go down to 720p and your frame rate does not increase, then it is most likely a CPU bottleneck, or it could just be the that game or that software that is limited to the performance that you're getting. So you can have a software bottleneck as well, which is in-game bottlenecks. So in another game, you might go from 1080p down to 720p and gain no frames at all. Now, usually that would mean that your CPU is being the bottleneck and your card is carrying everything. So if you went from 720p to 1080p and then to let's say you go to 2K and the performance doesn't change at all, well, then that is definitely going to be either the software or the CPU. Now there's another bottleneck here that you can see as well, which is your RAM, and your RAM can do funky stuff when it is not right. Okay, so you want to make sure you got some high-end RAM that can feed to the CPU. Now, RAM's a really hard one to tell if it's bottlenecking your computer, but if you change your RAM to higher speed RAM, if you go from I think it's 2600 megahertz is lowest for DDR4, and I think the lowest for DDR5 is 4000 megahertz, let's say. If you go from 2600 megahertz from DDR4 to 3600 megahertz, you can see an increase of up to about 30 frames a second, or even more sometimes, depending on the game or the program that you're using. You can see your render times decrease with higher RAM speeds. You can see your games run smoother, things open up faster, just everything seems to work more snappier. Okay guys, I'm going to leave the video here, and hopefully this has helped you out, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Hey guys, it's BuddyMate here. If you like my video, please give us a handy dandy thumbs up, and if you hated my video, give me a handy dandy thumbs down. Please subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.